The main character of today's case is HH Holmes. The real name of HH Holmes is Herman Webster Mudgett. By the 21st century, a man named HH Holmes had become a permanent part of American folklore as the man who built a murder castle to torture and kill hundreds of victims that had come to town to visit the World's Fair. He was given the title America's first serial killer since his 1890s reign of terror. The tale of the notorious villain has evolved and changed so much that there is often more fiction than truth, and present-day retellings today many details about Holmes and his crimes have been proven false, but the true story isn't any less brutal or gruesome. The early life of Herman Webster Mudgett. Herman was born on May 16, 1861 to Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Mudgett in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, USA. Both Herman's parents were descended from the first English immigrants in the area. By all accounts, young Herman's life was relatively normal and unremarkable. There are no reports of Levi and Theodate being anything other than upright, respectfully attended church. None of their neighbors or extended family members had anything bad to say about them. Not even about Herman himself. On the contrary, he was remembered as being a quiet and studious young man with refined taste and no interest in participating in the rough games of his peers. There were those who had some doubts as to whether Herman was as perfect as everyone thought. But there was something about Herman that he did not like. Some of it had to do with Herman's love for money. One time the young man stole 43 cents from the cobbler's vest pocket, and another time he tried to get paid twice for the same work. His fondness for money did not go unnoticed by other locals either, and it would not disappear as he grew older. One neighbor also noted that Herman was a bit of a loner, saying he always seemed to be by himself. Instead of playing with the other boys, he would wander off alone on long walks. He never was much of a favorite with other boys, and they did not understand him. He seemed to be very secretive. By the age of 16, Herman had graduated from Phillips Exeter Academy and was now working odd jobs alongside teaching in Gilmanton and later in nearby Alton. Around this time he met a woman named Clara Lovering. There are differing details about how the two became a couple, but it's thought the pair were married on July 4, 1878. Clara's family were not overly pleased at the speed at which the pair's relationship had progressed, but despite this they set Herman up with a job working at Clara's uncle's grocery store in East Concord. He was still working there when the couple's son Robert Lovering Mudgett was born on February 3, 1880. Herman did not see himself working as a clerk forever. Instead, he wanted to study medicine, and his autobiography, H.H. Holmes, told a story from his childhood when two other boys had dragged him inside a doctor's office and put him face to face with an actual skeleton. Little Herman had been terrified and fascinated at the same time. That moment sparked a lifelong interest in human anatomy. And so years later Herman became an apprentice to the same doctor to which office he had been dragged as a boy, Dr. White. After a year studying under him, Herman enrolled in the University of Vermont in Burlington at age 18. But as he was dissatisfied with the school, he dropped out after a year. Then in 1882 Herman entered the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, from where he graduated in June 1884. Herman was nearly prevented from graduating when a widowed hairdresser accused him of making a false promise of marriage to her. So-called breach of promise was a rather serious crime back then, but it was not until after his graduation that Herman told his professor that the accusations were indeed true. In addition, it had been during his time in school when Herman and his friends first came up with the idea of faking someone's death and using a substitute body to defraud an insurance company. This idea would live and grow in Herman's mind for years to come. After his graduation, Herman was left separation and the birth of H.H. Holmes. Alone as Clara with their child moved away. According to reports, the marriage had been abusive, but as Clara never received divorce papers, the two technically stayed married until the very end. In 1885, Herman moved to Chicago and adopted the moniker H. Holmes. Soon he began working in a pharmacy owned by Dr. Halton and his wife. Now a common misconception is that the Haltons were an elderly couple or that Holmes killed them to get the store for himself. Neither is true. The couple were actually still living in the neighborhood when Holmes was eventually arrested, and according to records at the time he bought the store from them, the Haltons were in their 20s. Holmes starts work on the murder castle. Nevertheless, soon after, Holmes also purchased an empty lot across from the drugstore at the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in Inglewood. There he began constructing a building that would become known as the Murder Hotel or Murder Castle. At the time, the building was designed to have 2 floors. The first was to be for retail spaces, and the second for residential apartments, one of which Holmes moved into with his second wife, Myrta Belknap. It would take another 5 years to add the 3rd floor, which allegedly would serve as a hotel in time for the upcoming World's Fair. However, this would never come to pass while many descriptions or oddities of the building have been proven wrong. There undoubtedly were some strange features. For example, there was a hidden compartment between the first and second floors, and the stairs between floors could be accessed from a trapdoor located in one bathroom. These were later labeled as secret chamber and secret staircase. Nonetheless, the truth is they were not really secret to anyone, at least to anyone who worked in the building, and many hidden rooms were most likely used to store stolen furniture and other goods schemes. Affairs and murders during this time in his castle, Holmes ran a variety of strange businesses and schemes. It seemed like every week he had a new business plan, but his favorite seemed to be buying goods on credit, selling them, and never paying the original bill. Another scheme he was fond of involved using people and then killing them. It is impossible to say when Holmes took his first victim. There were rumors of murders happening in his childhood and college and during his first years in Chicago, but there is little to nothing to prove any of these allegations, notwithstanding the murders that we know happened and can be connected to. Holmes usually had a clear motive. Someone knew too much of his schemes or was getting in his way. It appears that H.H. Holmes did not kill simply for the bloodlust. Instead, it seems he did what he felt necessary to continue his lifestyle. The first couple of years with his new wife, murder seemed to have been going nicely, but by the time their daughter was born in 1889, Holmes was having an affair. He had hired a man named Icilius Ned Connor to work in his building, and with him came his wife Julia and their young daughter Pearl. Ned and Julia soon divorced, with Julia staying in the castle. Holmes had set his eyes on her early on, and it wasn't long before he got what he wanted. Soon Julia's name began to appear in connection with numerous schemes and frauds, in addition to his first wife's and murder's mother's name. Then one day Julia and her daughter Pearl disappeared without a trace. Holmes said they had gone to visit family, but nobody ever saw the two again. The next victim was a young secretary called Emmeline Sigrand, with her story being very similar to that of Julia. In 1892, Holmes had offered her double her current salary to work with him, and it wasn't long before their relationship became intimate. However, when autumn arrived, there were signs that Emmeline had changed her mind about Holmes. Nobody can say for sure, as by December she had also disappeared. A few months later, Holmes began using his charm on another young lady, a wealthy orphan named Minnie Williams. She knew the handsome man with a bushy mustache. Soon enough, Minnie was working in the castle as Holmes' personal stenographer, and just a month later they were presenting themselves as husband and wife, even though they were never actually married. Nevertheless, Minnie was soon part of her husband's schemes. Unknowingly, of course, amongst other things, she signed away several of her real estate holdings to Holmes. She even became the titular owner of a property in Wilmette where Holmes was building a house for murder. And Lucy, his real wife and daughter. By July 1893, both Minnie and her younger sister Anna had vanished from the face of the earth. Holmes left Chicago half a year later in January 1894 and met his fourth and final wife Georgiana Yoke in Denver while using the name Mr. H.M. Howard. Meanwhile, a man named Benjamin Pitezel in the insurance fraud plot. Benjamin Pitezel had moved to St. Louis, Missouri with his family. Benjamin had worked for Holmes for many years and was very well aware of his numerous schemes. He had been Holmes' true partner in crime, so when he was then contacted by Holmes, who had a new plan in mind, Benjamin was immediately in. The pair planned to defraud an insurance company out of $10,000 by taking out a policy on Benjamin, then faking his death. Pitezel was to pose as an inventor who would be killed in an explosion. Holmes would then procure a suitable cadaver that would be burned beyond recognition in the resulting fire. Sounds simple enough, but this time Holmes was playing his partner. In August 1894, Holmes and Benjamin traveled to Philadelphia where the plan was to take place. Before leaving, Benjamin he had a talk with his eldest daughter, saying, "If you hear about me dead, don't worry about it." After all, he was not supposed to die for real. It is not known for sure why Holmes did what he did. Maybe he had become concerned that Benjamin could no longer be trusted, or simply couldn't be relied on to convincingly pull off the plot. Nevertheless, when Holmes met his former confederate in Philadelphia, he first made sure Benjamin got extremely drunk before giving him a lethal dose of chloroform and setting his body on fire. Afterwards, Holmes did quite a terrible job trying to stage the death as an accident, but the Pennsylvania coroner bought it anyway, with Fidelity Mutual Insurance agreeing to issue a check for $7,200 to Carrie Pitezel. Holmes' quest to wipe out the Pitezel family. Holmes then informed Carrie the Benjamin owed him $5,000, which she quickly paid, even though Holmes now had his money. There were two problems. First, the Pitezel family knew too much, and secondly, they still thought Benjamin was actually alive and hiding out in London, so he began feeding lies to Carrie with her, eventually entrusting 3 of her 5 children to Holmes' care. All 3 were murdered by Holmes, who would later admit that he had locked 2 of the pitiful children in a trunk. He had drilled a hole and he then hooked it up to a gas line, asphyxiating the two girls before burying their bodies in the basement of a property he rented in Toronto. Investigators would later find that he had poisoned Howard, the third Pitzel child, before dismembering his body and burning his remains. Holmes would most likely have wiped out the entire family given the chance, but to him his time was running out. Holmes is captured and charged. His murder spree finally came to an end when he was arrested on November 17, 1894. In Boston, he was initially charged for horse theft. Back in Texas, however, charges quickly escalated to insurance fraud, to which Holmes eventually confessed. When investigators then found the corpses of Alice and Nellie and the remains of Howard Pitzel, interest in Holmes and the case exploded suddenly. Through people knew Holmes and had been working all visiting his murder castle. Everybody wanted to be a part of the story. This led to many sensational headlines about the building and how it was filled with torture rooms, secret passages, and quick-line pits. The only problem was that the stories were almost all fiction. In fact, in Chicago, authorities never found enough evidence to charge Holmes for any crime despite searching the castle through and through. In the end, H.H. Holmes was charged with only one murder, that of Benjamin Pitzel, eventually being convicted and sentenced to death in 1895. While Holmes was waiting for his execution, he confessed to 27 murders. The truth of these confessions is questionable, as there are reports that a newspaper had paid Holmes $7,500 to confess, and that some of these he claimed to have murdered were still alive. He had been a liar and swindler for much of his life, and he didn't change now that the end was in sight. Before his confession, he claimed he was innocent before, later stating he had been possessed by the devil. Finally, a little more than a week before Holmes was hanged, H.H. Holmes was hanged at Philadelphia's Monumentsing prison on May 7, 1896. His neck failing to break when he dropped through the trapdoor, he was slowly strangled to death over a 20-minute period. In accordance with his last wishes, his coffin was encased in concrete so as to stop grave robbers and buried 10 feet deep. His killing was over, but he left behind an endless amount of unanswered questions. Where did Minnie and Anna Williams and Emmeline Segrant go? Holmes never admitted to murdering them, nor had their bodies ever been found. However, he did say he accidentally killed Julia in a botched abortion before killing her daughter Pearl, just to cover up his mass like he had done to Benjamin Pitzel's children. Unfortunately, we will most likely never know the whole truth about what happened. One can understand the appeal of a tale about a notorious serial killer owning a murder castle with hidden tortured chambers and hundreds of victims buried inside its walls, but the truth is the real story of H.H. Holmes is far less sensational but no less gruesome. As for what became of the so-called murder castle, well, it managed to survive an attempt to burn it to the ground in 1895 before being pulled down in 1938. In one final twist, the stories and myths around Holmes had grown so strong that over 100 years later, in 2017, his body was exhumed after claims emerged that he had actually managed to escape execution. The belief being that the coffin was empty or that the body within was someone else's, much like many other stories about him. The truth turned out to be less strange, as DNA tests found that the body inside was indeed Holmes. The timeline of this case was 1861 to 1896. Because of that, the majority of the facts in this case derived from rumors and regulation. That is the reason why there are no many concrete evidence and part are missing in this story.